Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here at the Snowden Deli. I'm Aaron Rand from CJD, along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette, and our special guest today, the Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, the Liberal MP for at least another month.
Yeah,
2 months.
oh, 2 months.
Former environment ministerial, wore a couple of different hats in government. So for people just as background, before we get into your decision to step down as environment minister and basically get out of politics, historically, so you co-founded Equiterre.
Yeah.
You were director of Greenpeace in Quebec, and famously, and I wonder how you look back at this now, scaled the CN Tower back in the day as a much younger man.
Much younger.
Yeah. You've been involved in the environment, in climate for pretty much your entire adult life.
Yeah.
How did you get into this originally? What drove you to this?
I think so I come from a small town in Lac Saint-Jean and Lac-Chic, halfway between Lac Saint-Jean and Shawinigan. And our house was on the outskirts of the town when I was a kid, and behind the house was a forest, and that was my playground for many years, until one day they started cutting down that forest to make way for a new development, newer than ours. And I came into the house and I told my mom, who wasn't an activist by any stretch of the imagination, I said, "Mom, they're cutting down our forest." It wasn't ours, but for the little boy that I was, kind of meant something. And she said, "Well, if you climb a tree, they won't be able to cut it." And what did I do all day long as a young kid playing in the forest? I climbed trees. So I did it with my mom's permission. I climbed in a tree and I stayed there all day. And that day, they weren't able to cut that tree. They cut it a few days later when I was in kindergarten. But I think, I think this was an important moment for me. It made me realize a bunch of things, not as a 5-year-old, but later on in life. And in 1995, as we were putting together Equiterre, which is now the largest environmental organization in Quebec and one of the largest in Canada, we started hearing about this meeting in Berlin, the United Nations on climate change. It was called the Conference of Parties, so-called COPs. So it was the first one, and we said, okay, we have to go, but we have no money. We weren't even an organization per se. It was to ease an idea. But we started passing the hat around, and different Quebec environmental organization checked in. And a buddy and myself went to Berlin. We shared a gymnasium floor with 600 kids from all over the world, and we attended that first Conference of Parties. And now, COPs are much more well-known now. Tens of thousands of people participate every year. There was one in Paris in 2015, where Prime Minister Trudeau was just after being elected. And that moment really shaped the rest of my life. Like I met all these people, scientists, activists, negotiators from all around the world. And the issue of climate change was like emerging as something humanity needed to tackle.
And when you were brought in as the environment minister, it was like almost trumpeted from the rooftops, like Mr. Trudeau, was such a bold move to bring in someone with a kind of environmental, very courageous, and all the rest. And he was applauded all over the place. And then suddenly, it seems when we're trying to curry favor with oil industry or so on and so forth, gas, that we fell short of that. And like the lack of interest, it seemed, and clearly led to your decision, like in terms of where are we going here? At one point, everybody was worried about climate change. Everybody was active on the front. And now it's like a passing conversation. No one really wants to get into, it seems.
Clearly, things have changed over the last few years. The tariff war with the U.S., the constant threat in one form or another by President Trump, the geopolitical situation is much more complicated. But when you start digging in, really, Canadians still care deeply about climate change. It just so happened that right now they care more about other things. Cost of living is certainly had an influence, but there was a hold on, I believe, by Abacus, David Coletto, a few weeks ago, saying that for 40% of Canadians, it's still a very important issue. So it's not a majority, but 40% is not nothing either. So I understand the shifting priorities, and certainly for the government. And I understand that even when before Prime Minister Carney was elected leader of the Liberal Party, that things were going to change. What I had not anticipated is the rollbacks. Like I think something can be less of a priority and you can continue moving ahead in terms of the implementation, continuing, if you're not announcing new measures, keeping the ones that are already there to make sure that you're still moving along. And that's the thing where I respectfully disagree with the Prime Minister. I believe that he should continue fighting climate change, even though it's not the priority for Canadians that it was. I think we ignore climate change at our own perils.
Oh, agree.
I have supported as a cabinet minister our decision to invest massively in defense to meet our NATO targets. We need to do that for a number of different reasons. Our neighbor to the south, geopolitical shifting landscape. But we haven't seen tens of thousands of Canadians being displaced because of Canada's interference
But in lieu of like oil pipelines and all the rest, it became an inconvenient thing to talk about, trying to curry favor with, let's say, Alberta and so on. So they just sort of brushed under the carpet, and I couldn't agree more. But the prevailing thought, like, I mean, in the States, I mean, in terms of like coal and everything else, it's just that they've gone completely backward in terms of believing there's anything called climate change, anything called an environmental problem.
It is interesting, and it will become somewhat tragic, but by the end of the year, we will have analysis of where Canada is in terms of its fight against climate change and other nations around the world, including the United States. And I anticipate that the US will rank better than Canada, despite Donald Trump.
Really?
Really. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is better than Mark Carney when it comes to fighting climate change. That is not at all what I'm saying. But we're talking about coal. Because they still produce so much electricity through coal in the US, and that renewables have become so much cheaper, even in states that aren't very progressive, like Texas, for example. Texas has become the largest producer of wind energy and solar energy.
Trump is not a fan of that either.
Trump is not a fan of that, but there's not much he can do about it. And so we're seeing coal-fired plants being closed one after the other and replaced by not just renewable energy. There's also a fair bit of gas-produced electricity that's coming online in the U.S. But by the end of the year, we will likely be in a situation that, despite Donald Trump, the U.S. will be doing better than Canada in the fight against climate change.
Can I go back with respect to your own history? And it's funny because I remember riding a train to Quebec City for the provincial budget, and you being on that train every year. You were there. You were, petitioning government, saying we need to do more, we need to do better. You talked about, Justin Trudeau, courageous decision to have you come on board. I wonder from the other perspective, you as an environmentalist dealing with a government, and what made you, or were you hesitant at least about going ahead and saying, wait a sec, if I stop what I'm doing here, I'm not sure how much free reign I have being part of a government. So that was a very strange decision, I think, for you to have to make at the time, was it?
Yeah, it was. In politics, we say that men are much more easier to convince to run than women. Political parties will tell you have one or two meetings with a guy, and he's in or not, but you'll know very quickly. With women, it takes more convincing. You'll need more meetings, like 4 or 5. It took me 6 months to decide, so I must have a very pronounced feminine side. It was I knew Prime Minister Trudeau from before his time in politics. We weren't friends, but we would run into each other. We had common friends. I knew a number of people who were working with him, Catherine McKenna, who's Environment Minister, some of his advisors. And I thought, he said, come and help us. We want to do more. We want on climate, on nature, fighting plastic pollution. The Prime Minister had just announced he wanted to ban single-use plastic. He said, I need someone to help me do that. And I said, okay, I've been doing activism outside government for 25 years. Maybe it's time to try to do it inside government.
But then I think at some point, here's the new guy, not a political guy, who's been fighting against governments. Now you're in the government. And it became apparent, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, fairly quickly, that despite the promises and pledges that the Prime Minister was making, goals that we're going to be setting, that they weren't getting met. Did you have a moment where you said, okay, maybe I made the wrong decision? Maybe this was, hey, come on board. It looks good for the government to say we got an environmentalist, but nothing is really changing. The promises that are being made are not being kept.
Before I came into politics, I was basically an environmental lobbyist with Iquifer. Like, I was working with the Quebec government, as you said, working with Ontario. I was on stage with Rachel Notley, Premier of Alberta, in 2015 when she announced her climate change plan.
Right.
I'm from Quebec. She wanted to show that there was broad support for what she was doing. I worked BC government, federal government, the United Nations. So I have a fairly good idea that it's not easy moving things inside government. Kind of, right. It's not easy. It's complicated. You can't, I have 4 kids at home. I never win all of my battles with my 4 kids. I was under no illusion that I wasn't going to win all of my battles in a country of 40 million people, where not everyone thinks the same thing, has the same priorities. So I had anticipated that it would be tough, that it wouldn't move as rapidly as I wanted to, but we were making tremendous progress. I mean, there are some years and not too distant past when Canada outperformed all of our G7 neighbors in terms of reducing climate change pollution. We've made incredible progress on nature protection. When Prime Minister Trudeau comes into power in 2015, Canada is not protecting 1% of our oceans and coastlines. We're almost at 17%. It's historical what we're doing, and what we're doing on conservation and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is also groundbreaking. Like I still meet people. I was in a call yesterday with folks internationally. What we're doing there, and fortunately, Prime Minister Carney has decided to keep that going on nature. On climate change, it's more complicated. So if I had to do it all over again, if I was asked, would you do it? I would say yes in a heartbeat.
Which is what I found.
Hold on, so you would say yes, having gone through everything you went, having lived with those disappointments and failures, if we can call them that, but it was worth doing and you would do it again.
Oh, yeah.
Then why are you leaving?
Well, because I feel that certainly on the issue of climate change, I have no more influence on the direction that our government is taking.
Okay.
And for me, different people come to politics for different reasons. For me, politics was always a means to an end. How could I, in working inside politics, help advance the issues of climate, of nature? And now that I can't do that, at least on climate change, it's time for me to move on and continue doing that inside politics.
Well, what I found interesting is when you left environment, then you went into the language, identity, ministerial positions, which, I mean, interesting, but the way a lot of us thought of you was strictly environment. Were you happy doing that work? I mean, you didn't seem to have the same zeal, the same vigor.
Well, so when I was elected in 2019 and made my way directly into cabinet as heritage minister.
Right.
I was a heritage minister for 2 years before coming to the environment.
But after?
But I must say that when I was first nominated heritage minister, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing out here? I'm a fan of the arts and culture, but I'm not an expert. Like, there's this imposter syndrome that some of us, at least I felt. And then I started meeting artists and people in the sector, and many of them said, oh my God, we're so happy to have an activist as culture minister because we feel we need someone like that. And in those days, we got, during the pandemic, I was able to work with the Prime Minister and the finance team to get the largest investment in Canada's history in the arts and culture. We basically saved the ecosystem, introduced legislation to make sure that online platforms pay their fair share when it comes to arts and culture in Canada. And so when Prime Minister Carney asked me to sit in cabinet, but again as heritage minister, they changed the name. But
to identity.
He allowed me to keep the nature file. So I was identity, culture, and nature minister. I was like, okay, I know the arts and culture sector now, or better. after having been a minister for 3 years, I can continue doing some environmental work. It was an interesting mix, and although you're right, people didn't expect to see me or don't expect to see me be the minister, official languages, for example, and things like that. But I would argue that activists can make pretty good cabinet minister, because as an activist, you identify a goal, you figure out who are your allies, your opponents, what's the strategy to achieve that. And as a cabinet minister, that's often what you have to.
Well, no doubt about that, but nonetheless, your heart burns for like environment, and it was pretty obvious, and it was very disappointing to a lot of people because they didn't have a champion of sorts to stand up for these things, and I don't think, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to ask the average Canadian who's in charge of the environment now, and they give you a right answer.
True, as we were saying, it's less of a priority at the same time. And I was for Prime Minister Trudeau, it was a priority. Canadians were very involved, and I was a very visible minister. And the environment was always, during Prime Minister Trudeau's tenure, one of his top 3 issues. Like sometimes it'd be number 1, number 2, number 3, but it never fell down from that. So I think it's probably true that fewer Canadians would be able to say who's the environment minister now than when I was there. But I think has a lot to do with circumstances.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the home of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus Carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowden Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowden Delicatessen. So if you kind of move the clock forward now, we're past Trudeau. We know what's happening. Mark Carney becomes the prime minister. A lot of people thought at that point, given the fact that, I mean, we now have the benefit of hindsight, carbon issue, pro-pipeline, all things that you have been against adamantly from the get-go. And it's interesting because when you announced that you were leaving, I remember we had analysts on kind of suggesting, you know what, surprised it took this long. Why didn't he leave earlier? Here's a guy who does not agree with his policies, yet he stuck around. I think some people held that against you, almost like you sold out to a new prime minister who said, look, I appreciate you being here, but my policies and your policies, they don't go together. What made you decide then? Why did you not do it earlier? Were you hoping that things would change? What impression did you get from the prime minister that things might change that kept you there?
So the federal government signs a memorandum of understanding with Alberta at the end of November 2025. I'm presented this document just a few days before it's made public. I'm asked to make some suggestions. I do. By then, it's pretty much signed and sealed. Alberta's like, of course, we're not changing anything. We like this deal the way it is. In our political system, if you're a member of cabinet, you're bound by cabinet solidarity. So you have to be supportive of all the decisions, whether or not you agree with them. So I felt I couldn't do that. I decided to leave my cabinet position. As a member of parliament, you have more freedom, even within the ruling party, to express your views. And I certainly did that. I wrote some op-eds in different newspapers. I did some interviews saying, well, here's why I disagree with this agreement. And I was hoping, I wanted to see if I could still have some influence and if I would be able to influence the outcome of these negotiations between the federal government and the government of Alberta. And when the final agreement was announced, I announced that I was resigning 2 weeks later. So I didn't wait a whole lot of time afterwards, but I did want to see it. Would I still be able to have an impact on the outcome?
And it became obvious you could or would.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you have discussions? I mean, the prime minister obviously knew how you felt, which where you spoke. Did he take some time to try to convince you to stay, saying that, you know what, this is the deal we have right now. Maybe down the road things might change, but for now, we have a deal with Alberta. It's good for the country. This is why I'm doing it, and I'd like you to stay. What was the discussion between you?
So I was told that maybe there was a possibility for me to come back to cabinet if I wanted to, different portfolio. I think what I was told is that they liked having my voice around cabinet table. They like having me being part of that team, not just for environmental issues, but I was this Quebec lieutenant for a while. And I think they would have liked me to stay, but not comment or not
Not always.
raise my voice on environmental issues. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier. Like for some people, being in politics is an end in and of itself, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's not me. That's not why I came into politics. So I think it's a disagreement about the. I understand the Prime Minister's being concerned about the separatist movement in Alberta and wanted to try and find ways to appease this. So I agree with that. I just disagree with the means we're using and then the solutions we're finding. We bought a pipeline under Prime Minister Trudeau to try and help with that in Alberta. It didn't help with separatism. It was supposed to help Rachel Notley, the NDP premier, get reelected. We now have Danielle Smith. We lost all of our seats in the 2019 election in Alberta and in the prairies. And I don't see how repeating the same thing will lead to different results. And that's where
So did you have it? Was there a disappointment from your perspective when the Prime Minister said to you, listen, we speak here as a team, right? You don't get to have an independent voice just because you're the environment minister and you don't like this deal. And if you can't go ahead and accept that, then you probably should consider resigning?
The Prime Minister never said that to me. I don't believe that threatening people is usually a good way of doing things. So that's never how I have approached it. But at one point I told him and his chief of staff and others, I said, listen, I'm not in a position to support this. And if this is the direction you're taking, I understand. You must understand that I will take a different direction.
Right.
Did they try to convince you otherwise, though? Just the last, but when you said that, we like you as a minister, we like what you're doing, we like what you stand for, please, would you reconsider? Or was it just...
No, we had several conversations, very polite and respectful conversations about that.
And they understood that was it for you. That was the deal breaker.
Yeah.
You had to leave.
Yeah.
I can't see going quietly into the night now that your term is ending at the end of August. It's not in your DNA, I know. You're going to be on the activist front once again. I wonder if you have any concrete plans in terms of the environment, in terms of getting involved on some other level.
I think you're generally right. I suspect that I will continue being involved, being active one way or the other. I honestly don't know what I'm going to do, with the exception of in about 2 weeks, I'm leaving for the Arctic on the ship with 40 Canadian youth. And it's about climate change. It's also about reconciliation with Indigenous people because half of the youth are Indigenous. It's an organization, it's a fantastic organization called Students on Ice that does that every year. They bring kids to the north to try and teach them and exchange on the issue of sustainability and reconciliation. So I'm going to do that, and then I don't learn.
You must be terribly concerned about the state of the planet at this point in time. How worried are you about our future, your kids' future, so much else? I mean, when you look around, you can't be overjoyed.
I'd say mixed feelings. Often when we look at environmental issues, we tend to focus on what's here and now or what's anticipated, and we forget to look back to where we're coming from. I was talking to you earlier about this UN meeting I attended in 1995. There was almost no coverage of this in the Canadian media then. There was 1 or 2 articles maybe. And in those days, when I started talking about climate change, people called me a watermelon. I was green on the outside, red on the inside. I was a communist disguised as an environmentalist. Even my conservative opponents don't say I'm a communist anymore. I mean, they accuse me of a whole range of different things, but really not being of a communist. I think we've made a lot of progress. Right now in the world, 10 years ago, for $1 invested in increasing fossil fuel production, it was $1 invested in clean technologies. Today, it's 2 for 1 in favor of renewables. So there's twice as more money globally going into the solution than the problem. Just 10 years ago, 1 in 70 vehicles sold in the world, so 1 in 70 was an electric vehicle. Last year, 1 in 4. The world is moving away from fossil fuels very rapidly. And what happened in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz is just going to accelerate that. So part of me is very optimistic. At the same time, we have entered the era of climate change. We have tens of thousands of Canadians right now that are displaced every year because of forest fires, because of floodings. In Pakistan, just last week, the temperature in the south of the country went up to 59 degrees Celsius. That's pre-humidity. We've seen heat waves in Europe where literally people were dropping like flies on the sidewalk. So it's going to be tough for the foreseeable future. But I think if we continue collectively working on it, we can find a solution to that.
Where does the country end up? You know, I remember we were talking a while ago, given what's going on in the States and with the Trump administration and the idea of Quebec, you know, maybe it's time to start our LNG projects up. We have so many, natural resources under the ground that we don't utilize. And there seem to be two very different camps. Mm-hmm. One suggesting, no, even with the new techniques we have now, it's not any safer, it's not any better for the environment. Another saying, hey, we need to live in the reality, which is things are changing. We need to be able to go ahead and grab these resources. Where are you on that?
We can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, say we want to reduce our dependencies to fossil fuels, and on the other hand, say no to new wind parks or solar or critical mines. We will need those resources in terms of mining if we want to have more electric vehicles, if we want to have more wind turbines, if we want to have more battery storage, more solar panels. And I would sometimes debate my ex-colleagues or some of them from the environment movement saying, folks, we like it's an either or. Like either we stay with fossil fuels and we have more climate change, or we invest more in mining critical mines, and we move towards more sustainable transportation, more sustainable electricity production. But you can't have it both ways.
Why can't we begin trying to mine the resources that we have, say in this province, which we know would provide, jobs? And
we are doing it. As environment minister, I approved a number of mining projects for critical minerals, lithium, for example. Not just in Quebec, but all across the country. It is happening. Canada is blessed with those resources that the world needs, and on that I agree with the Prime Minister. Like, this is clear, and right now we're collectively totally dependent on China, a country with which I've had and continue to have good relations because of the work they did together in Montreal in 2015 and 2022 on nature. But it's not sustainable for so many of us, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, US, to be dependent for more than 90% of one country, that country being China. So I think we need to invest in those sectors, not just in mining, but we need to invest in the transformation of and the refining of these products in Canada with some of our reliable trade partners. And sometimes some investments that the government or governments will do won't work. We've talked a lot about some of the projects in Quebec that did not go so well. It's always the governments support projects left, right, and center. Some go well, some don't go well. We tend to only hear about the ones that will go belly up. But the reality is, federal government invested massively in the oil and gas sector. The Quebec government invested massively in aluminum, in steel. Governments do that all over the world. So this idea that every time we'll do something, it will go the way we think. It's a bit.
I have one last question, and this was asked of me when your story came up about you leaving, and people said, okay, if you disagree with the government, with the Carney government, because you couldn't see eye to eye, why not just have said, thank you, get up and leave? Why did you decide to stay? You could have just quit.
Well, I'm staying just for a few weeks, essentially to be able to complete some projects that my team and I have been working in the writing. A kids theater, a center for the LGBTQ community in the village. My writing includes the gay village in eastern Montreal. So there's a few projects like that I'm hoping to be able to complete. As you know, sometimes these projects can take a long time to come to fruition, and then many of them were on the cusp of being able to finalize them. But It's just a matter of a few weeks.
No, the idea being, you're so angry, things didn't work out. You throw your hat down and you leave and you never come back. But
I mean, I think I've tried to express my disagreement in a respectful way, and I didn't throw grenades around me when I left. I'm not burning bridges. I'm still being consulted by the government on things.
Okay.
On my way out the door. I've tried to do this in the most respectful manner possible. So I mean, am I disappointed by some of the things? Yes, but it's okay. That's life. You move on. You don't have to get angry at everyone because of that.
What's the message you give to your kids in terms of environment, in terms...
My kids have been incredible. My youngest was 10 when I started. She's now just graduating from high school. And they've been incredibly supportive. And you would be, I mean, maybe you wouldn't, but I've been certainly impressed and humble, but I can't walk in the streets anywhere in Canada without someone stopping me. I was in Toronto earlier this week, and my son was graduating from U of T. And downtown Toronto, 4 or 5 times a day, people would stop me and say, "Thank you very much for your service." It's been like that for months. And my kids are often with me, and they see that. And my message to them is, believe in your dreams. Like if the Stephen Guilbeault, the 56-year-old Stephen Guilbeault would have told the 25-year-old Guilbeault who was going to this UN meeting in 1995, hey, maybe one day you'll be the environment minister of this country.
So you're hopeful.
So much. I'm hopeful.
All right, we're going to wrap it up on that note. I want to thank you so much for being with us. Wish you all the best in the future, wherever that future happens to take you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
That wraps up another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast. We'll see you again soon.